This morning, we're looking at the topic, how to turn failure into success. Welcome everybody, welcome ladies and gentlemen. If you are a guest or a visitor here with us this morning, we'd like to extend a very warm welcome. The way we're looking at our topic this morning is through the creative arts. It's dance, drama, song, music and the spoken word. We've got a very special program organised for you this morning. Right now we have got the team that are going to sing us a song. So if you could put your hands together for the music team.
Good morning, my name is Yvonne and I'm here to take you through a couple of formalities. First of all, we're going to have some bags come across the rows and down the aisles. This is for our tithe and offering. We here as Hosanna Fellowship are committed to giving to God, but to you, our guests and our visitors that are here with us this morning, there is no expectation that anything is placed in these bags. If you wish to do so, we thank you. I'd like to pray for that offering. Thank you, Lord, for everybody here, what's been given for you. May it be used wisely for your glory, your kingdom. Amen. After this morning's special event, we'd love to have you stay a wee bit longer with us. We're going to have some refreshments put on in the foyer, which is through the double doors out the back directly behind us. We'd love to have you stay in fellowship with us. Next week, we've got something very exciting happening. It's going to be at 10:30 and it's going to be right here at Hosanna, and it's one of the biggest events of the year. It's very exciting. What it's all about is
the Children's Church production.
That's right, our children, ladies and gentlemen, are going to be putting on their annual production about what they've learned and the journey that they've come through this year. So 10:30 next Sunday morning, right here at Hosanna. It's going to be exciting. Now, there is one other thing that I have in my hand. It's a card. It's called Connecting with Hosanna. Now, if you feel you'd like to connect with us in some way, there is a lot of information on here as to how you can do that, how you can help us to help you to do that. So please feel free to fill that out, leave it in the box in the foyer, or hand it over to the person that you've come along with this morning. Now, very shortly, our musicians are going to lead us in a couple of songs, and we're going to have a time where we all get to participate, so you'll be able to stand up and stretch your legs. Just shortly after that, there will be a drama. Now, our drama this morning is quite strong, so we'd just like to advise you that it's quite graphical and it has very strong words and content, so please just be advised that that is coming up. So, it's time to stretch your legs. Everybody ready? If you'd like to all stand up, please, welcome all the music team.
morning. I have two readings for us this morning. What the wicked dread, well overtaken. What the righteous desire, well granted. If the axe is dull and its edge unsharpened, more strength is needed, but skill will bring success.
What the heck are you doing?
Nothing, but it doesn't look like nothing, Angela. What's going on? Can you guys just leave? Get out! Leave! We can't leave. We keep you. You're our friend. Fine, you can watch me off myself then.
Angela, what's wrong? Is it worth throwing your life away?
Yes! I can't do this!
Good, we're having the night.
No, I mean I can't do this with you here. Now get out!
We can't. Angela, you know this is not the best decision. What is it you need?
I don't know.
You don't know. Come on, Angela, think about this. You and I both know this is not the right decision.
I don't know, please.
Choose anything
I
but.
choose death.
Oh, we're crying out loud, Angela. What is it you want?
I don't know. I don't know.
Is it worth killing yourself over?
Angela, let's just think about this.
I'm through with thinking. I've done enough thinking for a lifetime.
Okay. Come on! You're gonna do it! Let's do it! Let's get it over and done with right now!
Jack!
You wanna eat it?
Jack!
Yeah, that's how we'll do it! We'll split the wrist, cut the veins, and blood all over the floor!
Jack, stop it!
Yeah, for the whole world to see, for your kids to walk in here and see light in a pool of your own blood! Is that how you want it?
Jack, give me the knife.
No, let's do it. Let's get it over and done with. I mean, life must really suck. It must be really crappy for you to want to end it all now.
Jack, stop it!
Stop it. Please.
Don't wait outside. Angela. What's going on?
I'm tired. Tired of trying. I feel like nobody cares. I feel all alone.
You've got heaps of friends.
That's just as shallow as I am. All they care about is how big the houses are, how much the husband do, how pretty they look in their new shiny clothes and the tiny mirror. I feel all alone, even when I'm surrounded by people.
But I'm here.
chisels I've told, carving idols of stone that have crumbled like sand beneath the waves. I've recklessly built all my dreams in the sand just to watch them all wash away. Through another day, another trial, another chance to reconcile to one who sees past all I see. And reaching out my weary hand, I pray that you'd understand you're the only one who's faithful to me. All the pennies I wasted in my machine, well, I go like stones to the sea. I cast my laughter off to my God, searching endlessly for faith to be faithful to me. Through another day, another trial, another chance to reconcile to one who sees past all I see. And reaching out my weary hand, I pray that you'd understand you're the only one who's faithful to me. You're the only one who's faithful to me.
Well, welcome this morning. We've got a whole bunch of people that are getting ready for the children's church production next week, hoping it's not going to be a failure. It won't be. We come to the subject this morning and we have all sorts of things we face in life. Sometimes failures are things that we can do something about, sometimes they're things we can't do something about. That's all. Excuse me, guys. It was on until I inflected. Okay, that's better, isn't it? The truth of the matter is, for every one of us, there are things that we face that are kind of failures of systems more than failures of ourselves. There's a story of the guy who goes to the doctor and he'd been having a series of tests and the doctor said to him, "There's good news and bad news. What would you like?" And he said, "I only want to hear the good news." And the doctor said, "Well, the good news that we're going to name a new disease after you." He couldn't do anything about that failure. It was a failure of a system. It was just one of those things that happens. But there are lots of failures that we face in life that, actual fact, are things that we can do something about. And what we want to do this morning is we want to transition from this place of being in a place of failure and turning it into success. In fact, what I'd like to suggest that we would like to do is to give it a new name for this morning. This is a new name I would like to suggest. Learning to Surf Cloud 9. Because all of us would love to be able to really enjoy every moment of our life without having a failure. Isn't that true? Hello, are you awake this morning? Isn't that true? Yeah. Most of us lament the failures we make. Some of us don't. One of the reasons we don't is because we're so blind to our own failings that we don't even see it. That's not helpful. Some of us, we do the types of things that we do because we just have always done them in our lives. We've been influenced by all sorts of things, and we're not going to try and embark on that journey this morning, but rather to try and actually turn the failures that we do face in our lives around to being places of success for every one of us in this room. I'd like to first of all approach it by thinking about the whole deal of failure. In terms of failure, you can see the sea here, dirty and rough. Some years ago, we were up on the coast near Porirua is a little bay there. The sea cut up awfully rough. There's an incredible amount of power in the sea that day. I always remember it. Normally the sea at the tide it was at, when it was coming in, wouldn't be anywhere near the roadway. This particular day, the sea was pounding in huge waves. There'd already been a boat lost at sea that day, and we went down to watch it. The people who knew the area knew something about this particular type of storm that happened. And the sea had been so rough that it had ripped the beach to pieces, it had done some damage to a cliff face, it had crossed the road at points. And friends of ours decided a little later in the day they'd go for a swim. The water was dirty, there were hunks of log floating around, and I just thought this was the most dangerous thing to do. Well, it was interesting because in actual fact they knew something we didn't know. When these storms happen, and just as the tide's at a certain point, there's absolutely no danger in the water there apart from maybe a few floating logs. And even though the sea looked fairly big, they'd been surfing for years around this area, and they knew that right at that point it was even safe for their children because the push on the water was in and it wasn't drawing people out at all. I was surprised. They went swimming in it. I tried to talk them out of it, and Neville, my friend, assured me that no, it's okay, we can do it now. You see, sometimes the failures we face are a little difficulty. You see, but the thing is that failure in itself can feel like rough and dirty water to us. We can feel like our friend here this morning, that life just isn't worth continuing on with. Or we can feel that we will never be able to do anything decent because of the failure that we may have met. Or we may be feeling that our failures are the kind of secret we keep to ourselves, but we know it's disempowering us in some way. We don't feel quite the person we could have felt. We know we will never achieve. And I want to say to you this morning that those things are just simply, in the long term, not necessarily true. That we can experience things that will change our lives if we look at it in the right way. So I want to start with a little bit of a story this morning. And I want to start with a guy who walked on water. Something that we can't even imagine doing very easily sometimes, although if we imagine it's in our dreams. And we need to understand that this is a guy, his name was Peter, who actually found himself in this difficult situation where he'd had this incredibly successful life. His life had been so successful in the last 3 years that nothing could have made him happier. He'd met up with a guy called Jesus. Some of you are familiar with him. And Jesus took him on a journey where he'd been able to walk on water. He'd been able to see people healed. He'd been able to see wonderful, wonderful things happen and transformation of people's lives. People who had lived terrible lives of failure, who were ending up being rescued. And it must have been the most exciting journey to have been on. I don't think we can even put ourselves in that place very well. I don't think we can even capture the full power of the kind of things that Peter was facing and the things he was enjoying. It was just an amazing story. But it came to a point where he felt that things, even if they got rough, he was strong enough to handle anything. He got to the point where he's so strong that he actually turned around to Jesus and he said, doesn't matter what happens. Doesn't matter what happens. I'll be there. I'm willing to die for you. In Jesus' own words, he said these words. He says, I've prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. Now, what's he saying? It's a funny little sentence if you think about it. He says, I'm praying for you that your faith will not fail, but when you turn back, then strengthen your brothers. In other words, I've prayed for you, but you are going to face failure. And when you've turned back and realised that you've faced it, then you'll be able to help your brothers. Now, I'm sure Peter, being who he was, pretty much a strong fellow, a fisherman, he's physically strong, there's no question about it. He was a guy who lived by his muscles, because in those days, that's what you needed to do fishing. You didn't have any winches, any powered motors, or any of that kind of stuff. He was a fisherman. He was tough. You see, he was Peter, the success who failed. He was Peter, the one who was a success who failed. See, what actually happened to Peter? Well, you see, pressure got on a wee bit, because in the middle of the night, when things like this shouldn't have happened in those days because it was against the law, a group of people came along to arrest Jesus because he'd been subverting the rulers of the nation, as far as they were concerned. Oh, he was going around healing people, and you're not allowed to do that because only they had authority to do that. He was going around forgiving people, you're not allowed to do that because only they had the authority to do that. He even had the cheek to raise somebody from the dead and to make some people be able to see. And you're not allowed to do that because only they had the priority on that, because they were the religious ones who were the leaders of the nation. And so they weren't allowed to do that, really. And so they decided to arrest him in an illegal hour as well, because you weren't allowed to do that in that nation in those days. The police don't seem to mind what hour they come nowadays, but in those days that was the rule. And so we end up in a situation where Jesus in the end gets dragged off. Now Peter shows us a moment of courage. He pulls out his sword and he whacks the ear off of one guy, Malchus. And to make things worse, not only had he failed, but he thought he's doing the right thing. And Jesus picks up the ear and pokes it back on the guy, sticks it back on, and heals it there. And then he tells Peter to put his sword away. And he was prepared right at that point. He thought he was doing something right. He was prepared to die. And nobody else had. Nobody else had risen up like Peter did because he was strong. So I want you to be aware of how strong he was, because the story takes a wicked turn. That's wicked in the old-fashioned word, not the modern one. It goes like this. I want to read it to you. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus because, this after he was arrested, because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the priest's courtyard. Now we know who the disciple was. It was John. And he goes in there. It's in the book of John, chapter 18, for those who want to follow it. And verse 15. But Peter had to wait outside the door because he didn't know the high priest. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back and spoke to the girl on duty there and brought Peter in. So he must have gone aside, arranged something to happen, and he got permission to take Peter with him. So he comes back out and he brings him in. You're not one of his disciples, are you? The girl at the door asked Peter. He replied, I am not. It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm, and Peter also was standing there warming himself with them. Meanwhile, the high priest questions Jesus, and so the story goes on. Then we pick it up a little later in verse 25. It says, as Simon Peter stood warming himself, he was asked, are you not one of his disciples? Are you? He denied it, saying, I'm not. And one of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. Didn't I see you with him in the olive grove? Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment the rooster began to crow. And Peter went off. And he was really very, very distressed. Because he had said, I will do this in my life. But the reality when it came is he did the opposite. He failed. He failed at a high edge. Jesus had already told him, when the rooster crows, then you'll remember, you'll know. That's the reality. And Peter had failed. You see, I think for most of us, we have things where we fail. And I want to look at the things that actually happened, which were part of Peter's failure. You see, what actually happened to Peter? Eventually, a lack of confidence came about. A lack of confidence in the face of trouble. That's what he had. The second thing he had was he was too dependent on another person. I've just put the wrong sheet up there, but never mind. He had dependence on another person, a very, very strong dependence on someone else. And so, he failed. The third thing I think that happened to Peter, he had an unwillingness to take personal responsibility for the things that he had said he would do. The fourth thing I would say that Peter had, he was zealous without appreciating the significance of his own contribution. He tended to just overstep the line sometimes, and he didn't really need to. Then the next one, the fifth one, he had a mouth that spoke too quickly. Peter was known for this. No, I'll do it. Or he was criticizing somebody, or he was always doing something in those early days. He was known for it, and I'm sure the other apostles, the other disciples, they knew that was Peter's weakness as much as he knew theirs. Then the sixth one, he had some kind of understanding of what he was doing, but he wasn't living with real purpose at this point because he hadn't understood what was happening. And in fact, he was slightly confused because the picture that they had was that Jesus was going to become king. And even though Jesus had talked about dying, one of the big foot and mouth things that Peter did, he says, no, you won't die. And he got told off. Get behind me, Satan. Pretty strong words. I tease the congregation here, for those of you who are visitors, I tease the congregation here that sometimes I would love to be able to say that to them. Some of them, not all of them. I know it would happen if I did. Maybe I should. But it's a thing that must have really stung Peter if you think about it. If I said that to you right now, and you'd done something dumb, just said something a little bit dumb, and I said, get behind me, Satan. Can you imagine what you would feel like? He dared to call me Satan. I'm getting out of this church. There's no... Don't have to add the rest of the words because you all know that they're there, don't you? That's the kind of thing that happens. And then the reason he was confused was because he was unable to see a God perspective in the middle of this whole deal. He didn't understand the perspective that God might have on the whole situation they're facing. Now, in terms of this whole thing, I want to now talk about things that others face. That some of us face a little different to perhaps Peter's situation. Sometimes there's a sense of purposelessness in our lives. What am I actually doing? What am I actually trying to achieve? What's happening with the next relationship? Why have I had so many relationships? What are the things that are really needling at me personally? Purposelessness. That's what it's called. It's not often identified that way. But people have a purposeless life. It just goes from one thing to the next without any real intention or structure or desire to get it right. And then they live with the pain of that without even realizing that that's actually the cause. Then the next one is fear. We often are paralyzed by fear, and one of the biggest mistakes we make is to fail because we live with fear. There are people who could be great achievers in this world, but their fear drives them beyond what they need to be driven. To a point where they're so paralyzed they just cannot do what they need to do. You know, fears that their children will do better than them. Fears that their families will fail in some way, and so they do all sorts of things that are meant to be helpful but actually end up being destructive. Parents often fail because they try to control their children instead of teach their children. There's a big, huge difference. Young people and children often fail because they don't do what they know they should be doing. At the end of the day, actually the fear of failure can cause us to fail even more than ever. That's the reality. I know people who have avoided sitting exams, who have been working in a job. One of the most recent ones I saw was somebody who really could have done quite well in their lives because they were intelligent, they were able, they were capable people. They managed to get a job. It was quite an important job to them. But when they went and got that job, they actually lied about the qualifications they had, and they never had the qualifications at all. And the Ministry of Transport pulled their truck up, and it was discovered. And they didn't need to fail. All they needed to do is to go and sit the exam. And I know they could have passed, and I know they could have done it easily. But they just weren't convinced. They just weren't convinced. So fear can paralyze us. Then there's other things. A lack of confidence. Now this is different than fear, although sometimes fear can be part of it. The lack of confidence can be there because the taught habits in a family. Or it can be because we've failed before and we haven't looked seriously at why we failed and sought to deal with the issues that are behind it. And so we end up really in a place where we just are paralyzed because of it. We just cannot get past our own failures. Then thinking that we are something that we are not. This is actually a really common one. I've heard over the years many people try to convince me they're going to do these great things. I hate to say this, but I've become a bit of a pessimist in some ways. People tell me I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that, I'm going to do this, and I sit there and think, how on earth are you going to do that? You can't even get the basics right. And if you can't get the basics right, if you're not prepared to fail, then you will never be prepared to succeed. One of the things, an old saying that we used to have at work, a man who never fails is doing no work. It's true. A man who never fails. In actual fact, it's not quite true in one sense, because a man who's ultimately failed is doing no work because they're afraid of failing. And so we live in life and we have these things, but we think we are something that we are not sometimes. And that'll cause us to fail. I know people who aspire to be in government as great debaters, but they can't even hold a conversation in their own home. Can't even hold a conversation with other people. They can't work through the issues that are really important for them to work through to actually achieve the goal they want to achieve. Now, that doesn't mean to say that it's impossible for them to achieve that goal. It doesn't even mean to say that they are not designed to do that. It just means that they are not being realistic about what they need to do to actually achieve those goals. Now, sometimes it may be realistic for them to sit down and think about the thing. I know some years ago there's a man that most of you have probably seen on television and maybe even seen in the flesh at times, a guy called Ian Grant. He's a guy who has an incredibly bad stutter. He felt like a failure as a child. He's so bad that when I was in Auckland once, I went to introduce him to a lady who I had just had some influence over her life and had been quite helpful to her, and I wasn't going to be around, so I wanted to introduce her to somebody who was in the church that we were in so that she would have somebody to connect with, and he was a guy who was well known and all the rest of it. So I went up to him, and I forgot that Ian had a bit of a problem with stuttering. And I went up to her and I went up to him and I said, Ian, I'd like you to introduce you to Isabel. And he stood there to his great and my great embarrassment and couldn't get a word out hardly at all. Now you would think that guy, because of that, would be absolutely affected. And that his life would be a disaster. But the reason that most of you have seen him is because when he's public speaking, he's as sharp and as clear as a razor. And it was only discovered once, years ago, when he was asked to, I think, share a story of a bit of his life. And he thought that was going to be a disaster, and so did some others around, but he got up and gave intent. As he got up to speak, his just sudden clarity was absolutely there. Now, I think he's a good example of somebody who had every reason to believe he was never going to be a public speaker. But he's one of the best in New Zealand. He's one of the best. So I would say that sometimes, that we can think the wrong things about ourselves. Then, another one. Sometimes there are people who are self-appointed authority in their own life, and they don't realise that what's actually happening is that their family becomes dysfunctional, their lives become dysfunctional, things actually happen where they haven't sat down and really worked out who they are. They've made decisions about who they want to be. And so we want to look at that this morning. And then the last thing I want to touch on, and I know there are probably multitudes of others, but I just wanted to give some thought to us this morning, is the enemy, well, I call it the enemy, when despair hits. Now sometimes, and I want to empathise with people that have faced terrible despair here this morning, because sometimes the despair we face has not been caused by us. Sometimes the despair that we face has been caused by somebody who's abused us or treated us badly, our family situation. Maybe we lost parents when we were young. Maybe we've been put through some duress that shouldn't be. Maybe we've had an experience of being raped either emotionally or physically, or there's all sorts of possibilities. And despair has taken a hold of our lives, and we just don't seem to be able to get out of it. And because of it, we just can't be committed to anything. We can't be reliable in anything. And we know we can't, and we know everybody else knows. Well, I want to say to you this morning, that's your experience. There's a lot of hope. So let's come to the key questions. The first one is, how can I turn failure around? How can I turn it around? What are the kinds of things I need to do to actually turn it around? Because all of us experience it. And if you're in denial, the fact you're denying it is a failure. So how's that? Let's think about it for a moment. Now, for every one of us, we are going to face situations that are beyond our control. One could ask the question, why is it that bad habits are much easier to develop than good ones? It's a funny thing, isn't it? We are bent towards failure more than we are to success. That's our bent. That's the way we are. We are sort of prone to that. Now, I know the Bible talks about it, but I don't think we always appreciate what it means. So how can I turn this whole failure around? Well, I want to start off by asking this question. We need to ask this question of ourselves. Who am I exactly? Who am I? I'm sure Peter in our story, he was feeling really brave when he says, don't worry, Jesus, I'll be by your side. I'm prepared to die. And his initial reaction was to do that, but when Jesus picked out the ear and stuck it back on Malchus, what did he do? He got totally confused. I'm prepared to die, and Jesus is screwing around with my head because I'm chopping this guy's ear off and he's putting him back on again. He must have felt so stupid. Because he thought he was being the hero. He thought he was doing the right thing. I'm sure he was convinced when he brought that sword down, he knew he was going to probably die with Jesus as well. It was a possibility. But right at that point, he got absolutely and utterly confused. And he must have asked the question, who am I? And there's a dance the only dance I ever do. And the group teased me about it because I'm not really a dancer, but never mind. It has a lot of significance in my life. And it tells a story of how Peter must have felt after the experience he'd been through. Jesus had died. Hope was gone. The king was not going to be the king. Everything was in a mess. All the disciples were scattered. All the miracles that Jesus did didn't work out. Surely he should have got himself off the cross. He was capable of doing all these other things. That guy on the cross who told him, can't you get off the cross yourself and save us and yourself? He even failed there. He was confused. And he's sitting in his room in absolute despair. Think about this. He hears soldiers and people coming down the street. He's totally convinced that soldiers coming to get him. The picture is so vivid and strong and powerful because you know what it's like. When you go through failure, everything else cascades on top and the imaginations of your heart grow bigger. You're sitting in a dark room and the shadows move. That happens to most of us at some point in our lives. The kinds of things that were going on in Peter's head. And then when Mary and John turn up his door and they're knocking on the door and say, hey, Jesus is resurrected. I know what I would have been like if I'd been Peter. I've got to be honest. I would have failed at that point because I was like, come on, you guys. That's stupid. That just does not happen. Well, the story goes on, and I don't want to complete it. I just wanted to focus on the fact that Peter must have asked himself, who am I? What am I now? I thought I was a strong guy. I thought I was a fisherman. I thought I understood what this was all about. I thought I knew what I've been doing the last 3 years when I've been wandering around with Jesus. I really thought I knew who I was. And man, I've gone through a lot of life change, and he had. He'd gone through some huge life change, but he would have been absolutely confused at that point. There's no two ways about it. And we need to ask ourselves, who am I? And to answer that question, I think there are two things that would be helpful for us to think about. The first is this. Do I clearly hear what others are saying? Do I clearly hear what others are saying? Now, some of us don't hear the negative things we should be hearing. A lot of us don't hear the positive things about ourselves that we should be hearing. I've seen it. I've watched it. You tell somebody, hey, you look beautiful today. On one hand, they think, oh, thank you. On the other hand, and I've counseled people being like this, why'd they say that to me? What's their motive? Da-da-da-da-da-da. Suspicion and all the stuff that goes on. It's the way it is. Do I clearly hear what others are saying? Or am I reinterpreting it? The second thing is, there are things that happen in our lives in relation to other people, and we need to ask this question. Do I miss the hints that are being given to me? What kinds of hints am I talking about? People do all sorts of subtle things. They'll give us hints in all sorts of subtle ways. They'll make a joke, and that's a really common way of trying to tell us something. And sometimes we can miss the point, and we laugh at it, and ha, 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 and don't realize the significance that the person's being too nervous to try and tell us what we really need to hear. Or, we invite them out for something, and they say, oh no, I'll come next time. But 10 times later, they'll come next time. And so we keep inviting them. They're giving us a hint, people, if that happens. Some years ago, I went through an experience a little like this. It was a situation where, a couple of 4 people that I was very, very close to. I was really close to these people. Invited them to my birthday party. We'd had them round to my birthday party several times. they didn't come. That's the first time that they'd never come. So I tried rearranging things so that they could be there, but they still weren't going to be coming. And I never realized right at that point that there was an issue between us. I had no idea. And I missed the hint. I just loved them so much. I thought, well, we've been close for a long time. I thought, well, no, obviously they are busy. But I thought it was a bit strange that they were busy like that. Normally they weren't, you know. And I had to think through that. Now, as it turned out, the problem that was between us was something I couldn't have done anything about. But it made me think at the time back through my life, through my childhood and my younger days, and to realise that over the years, there'd been a whole bunch of things that I'd done and others had done to me, which actually were hints. I know one of the ones I remember clearly doing myself is I used to hate being around people in particular. You wouldn't have got me speaking in front of a crowd. That would be hard for some of you to appreciate, but that's the way it was. And I didn't particularly like people at all. And one of the things that actually happened is that I was fairly gifted at electronics, naturally gifted. And when I was at school, I started a radio club, not because I wanted everybody else to be there in the radio club, because I knew there was a huge resource in the school of second-hand radios and amplifiers and things, that if we had a club, we could justify asking an assembly if people could bring them to the school. So I started this radio club with a teacher willing to support me. And we did this advert and got all these radios and all these things. And so I became, in the school, without intending to, I became all the nerds and the electronics nuts, and I was their little hero in a funny kind of way. Because we had this house that was given to us to use for the radio club that belonged to the school. We had all these radios and amplifiers. The place was stacked with them. So what used to happen, these guys came along to me, and I remember one day very clearly, I'd just built a new type of receiver. I'd developed this thing myself. It was working incredibly well. We lived in a riverbed in Christchurch, which meant that you could only receive the local pop station unless you had a very powerful radio. And I'd managed to design a very simple little device in this little circuit that meant that I could pick up 5 stations in the middle of the riverbed, which was just unheard of. So I became even more of a hero. And this young fellow came up to me, can you draw me an idea that might work for me? So I got a piece of paper and I drew this thing for him, a little circuit diagram, and said, go make it. And I intentionally sabotaged it so it couldn't possibly work, because I didn't want him hanging around me. The only problem was he went and made it and it worked better than mine. You know, we fail sometimes. He didn't get the hint because I helped him succeed, and it made it worse. We fail in lots of things that we do. So we need to ask that question, who am I? And do some real heart searching. And if you're not sure about who you are, can I make a suggestion that you either go and get somebody who can give you wise counsel, or talk to family members and friends and be willing to say to them, it doesn't matter what you say, I am not going to react. But boy, you better keep to your word. And ask the question, can you tell me the areas in my life where you think I might be failing at the moment? Could you tell me? Could you help me with this deal? And be prepared for some answers that maybe are not so good. When you're a pastor, you don't need to ask. No, you get told. Who am I? Ask the question. The next one. What points of failure do I not recognize? What points of failure do I not recognize? And this is a bit of a conundrum, because how do you ask yourself that question? If you don't recognize it, how do I discover what points there are there? Well, go back to the first point, and that might help a little bit. But could I suggest that you do even more than this? That you actually go through an intentional process of actually looking at everything you do and asking your peers at work or at school or wherever you are in the home, ask them, what kinds of things do you notice that you think that I have not recognized about myself? both my strengths and my weaknesses. Because sometimes our failure isn't the fact that we fail to do well or that we fail and because we're in a negative mode, but one of the biggest failures, I think, is even worse than that in some ways, is the fact we fail to recognize our strengths. Some years ago, I went through an experience where I had some gentlemen knock on my door here. Our house was right here, and the door was about over there somewhere, and this knock on this door, and there's two gentlemen standing in front of me. One of them I vaguely recognized. I couldn't figure out why. And he said to me, "Gary Colville," and I said, "Yes." And he said, he didn't say it's the police. He said to me, the gentleman speaking said to me, "We have come to have a talk with you." I said, "What about?" I imagine the worst. That's one of my proneness things that I have from my past. I'm a little bit prone to thinking the worst thing first instead of the best. I still have it a little bit. I'm better, but I'm not perfect on it. And I thought, "Oh, what have I done wrong?" That was my first thought. Oh, no. In any case, they said, "Well, we've been all over New Zealand, and some people told us you're really good at doing simulations." And I said, "Simulations? Haven't even heard of simulations. How could I be good at doing something I don't know about?" So we chatted, and he said, "Well, there's people in Oamaru." I said, "Who?" "People in Dunedin." I said, "Who?" He said, "People in Auckland." I said, "Who?" He said, "Everywhere we've gone around the country looking for somebody to set up a simulation for this large conference of around 1,000 to 1,200 people. He said, "Your name keeps coming up." I said, "But I've never done a simulation." And he said to me, I said, "Tell me, what is a simulation?" So he told me, he described the thing. I said, "They're real life experiences." Yeah, I've run some of those. And they said, "Would you like to do it?" Oh man, this is big. This is really big. I was a bit scared of the whole thing. I was really, if you get honest about it, I was really afraid of failing. It's okay doing it in a youth group, doing it in a church, doing it with 1,000 people from all around New Zealand who've come with a high level interest. There was a high potential to really fail. So I sat down and did some thinking, and I prayed. I talked to God about it, and in the end I felt I had to do it. That was it. I was compelled to do it. So I ran this thing. Got a group of 3 people gathered around with me, and we did some brainstorming. We did this thing. This was year 2010, an autocratic society where Christians had to come in and try and change the society. And we set up in St. Pat's College. We had 72 staff, all dressed in identical clothing, all seeing eye in the forehead, number on their lapel, which is a scary thing for most Christians because the symbolisms, your autocratic society, you lose your freedoms, you see, and Christians know about and love freedom. Well, afterwards, Peter McNee, who was the head of World Vision in New Zealand at the time, he sat down with me. He said, "Gary, you did a great job of the thing. There's just one area you failed in." Who wants to hear that? I sat there listening to Peter, and Peter said these words to me. He said, "Gary," he said, you've been too used to dealing with things the small way. You need to think about the way you process things." He said, when you were setting this thing up, he said, "I take my hat off to you. You got there, but you put a lot more energy in than you needed to." He said, "When you wanted something done with the local councils, the Wellington City Council and the Porirua Council, and that," he said, "you went to the minion at the bottom of the chain and you talked with them and you worked your way up." And he said, "That's hard work. If you want to do something well, you need to learn that you go to the top and don't start at the bottom." At the time, I didn't realize the significance of it. But Peter was a good instructor. And as a consequence, now I don't mess around with going to the little guy behind the desk. They got a good job to do, and I respect them. But if I've got a big thing to do, I've got to deal with it in a big way. And that was not an easy thing for me. I failed in that area. I created a huge amount of work, and as a consequence, I got to tell you, I put so much pressure on me that even though I had 2 weeks holiday after that conference, and even though I did have physical contact with chickenpox, I ended up with shingles in my face and 6 years of pain. And I think I failed because I put far too much pressure on myself by not dealing with things appropriately. Now, yes, I didn't know how to do it, but that's the whole issue, isn't it? What do I need to look at? What are the things I need to investigate? What points of failure do I have that I need to recognize, and what do I need to do to change those things? And that's what we need to look at for ourselves, each one of us here this morning. Right now, I want to look at the passage that was read out this morning by Bach. What the wicked dreads will overtake him. What the righteous desire will be granted. I think one of the worst failures that we actually have is that when we're motivated not by good things, we become the wicked. That's all of us in this room. There's nobody being counted different to anybody else in this room. Please be clear. If you claim to be a Christian, you can be just as wicked as anybody else. And by the way, wicked, young people, means bad, not good in this passage. All right? What the wicked dreads will overtake him. What the righteous desire will be granted. You see, I think if we start to get our lives a bit more sorted out and we start to do the right things, then it changes everything that happens. The second one that Bock read for us is this one from Ecclesiastes. It says, if the axe is dull and its edge unsharpened, more strength is needed, but skill will bring success. Now, what I'm wanting to say here, sometimes our lives are a little bit like the axe. We're a little bit dulled. We're not as sharp as we could be. Because we feel as if we've failed too often. We've hit a few nails in our lives as an axe. And it needs some sharpening. It needs some skill. But I want to say this to you. Don't give up before you start. You have no idea of your potential. God has wired, I believe, every one of us up to go way beyond what we ever achieve. And we've got to start believing it. Do you agree with this? Oh, one or two. Do you agree with it? Yeah, I think that's real. I've certainly discovered that to be the case in my life. The things I'm doing now that you just wouldn't believe. And for our congregation tonight, I've got such exciting news to share with the church. I don't want to dwell on it now because it'll take a wee while to tell a story. But what an exciting journey I've got to live. What an exciting life I'm living now. It's not because I'm a pastor, it's primarily because I have a relationship with God that has actually made me think about these things. It's made me think differently. See, the next question I want to ask is, what is the best way to approach beating my failure? What is the best way? Well, I think I'd just like to take 5 lives, and I want to touch on those 5 lives very briefly. The first one is this. In terms of keeping perspective for each one of us, these are the people I would like to look at. The first thing I want to... What's happened here? Oh, no, that's right. In God's vast eternal plan... I'll go to the 5 lives in a minute. I swapped the order and I forgot I'd done it. In God's vast eternal plan, the question I want to ask is, does it really matter? The thing that I'm facing right now, in God's vast eternal plan, does it really matter? And I think sometimes we get worried about things we shouldn't get worried about. We fail in areas we don't need to fail in because we just get things wrong. But at the same time, I want to say this, in keeping perspective and balance on the whole thing, some things do matter. Some things do matter. So let's look at these 5 lives now. The first one I want to touch on has to do with negative things. Even in negative things, we can learn. Certainly there's one person who I hope's learnt. You know? I don't know whether he really has. Talk about failure. I feel sorry for the man. The ultimate edge of failure is to be seen as one of the probably primary leaders of the world. And I know us in the Western world tend to see the President of the United States as being the primary person in the world, but there are other parts of the world like China and that don't see the Americans as being the primary leaders of the world at all. So don't buy into that American rubbish. You see, Bill Clinton, who is so significant, he even claims to be a Christian, could do the things he did. Disgusting. I hope he's learned. What did he need to learn? I think he needed to learn that above everything else, everything he did hinged on his integrity. Everything he did. And we touched on this last week. Maybe we should have done the 2 services in opposite order. But everything he did hinged on his integrity. And he failed at that basic level. And when you fail in integrity, then you failed badly. So what do we learn from it? Don't lose your integrity. Don't let things get all messed up like that. Then the second one is Martin Luther King, who on the other extreme had every reason to feel like life had let him down badly. Life was just the pits. But he said, no, I believe in a dream. I have a dream. I wish my oldest daughter was in here because she can still recite that speech after she learnt it when she was, I think, at Queen Margaret College or somewhere. She still can recite that whole dream. I have a dream that one day little white children, little brown children play in the street hand in hand. All sorts of things he said. It was just so radical. A guy who had every potential to be a failure, who actually was quite different. Now, most people don't know in the secular world. Most people don't realise who this Martin Luther King was fully. They know who he was in terms of what he did and the fact he gave this great speech. But he was a humble little old Baptist pastor. That's what he was. Who was determined not to let the failure of others to treat his people right and the failure of his people to know how to handle it well to control his life. And he spoke a message that turned America and the rest of the world eventually on its edge. You can pin it back to him and one or two others in the world that said some very profound things in that period of time. So even in the negative stuff, he was able to turn it around and say, whoa, world, watch out, I'm coming, in the right way. But he had a God perspective about it. Bill Clinton thought he had a God perspective. Well, people thought he had a God perspective, but the reality was it wasn't. Then the second group I want to look at, first one's Henry Ford. Not Henry himself so much, but he had a worker working for him, one of his managers, I think it was, who made a huge mistake. It cost huge amounts of money. I can't remember the amount right now. It's $600,000 or something. In those days, a lot of money. I think it was that figure. It doesn't matter what the figure was. It was just a big mistake. And somebody in the media went to him and said to Henry Ford, when are you going to sack him? I'm not sacking him, he said. Why not, says the reporter. He says, because he just learnt the most valuable lesson in his life. And we've just got a guy who's learned a great lesson, so why should we get rid of him? It's a $600,000 lesson. He's learnt it. Great attitude. Take my hat off to Henry Ford for having faith in a guy to be able to fail and to give him another chance. I'm sure that guy deeply appreciated that. But I'm sure Henry Ford also stood him on the mat and said, you messed up. You really screwed this thing badly. Now, how can we get it sorted? How can we get it right? What do we need to do? And what a wonderful attitude to have. Don't you agree? And that's the kind of thing we need to do to ourselves and to people we're relating to people we work with, to our people and our family. If our children screw up, don't do this. And I've got to say this really with integrity. Don't keep telling your children they're useless. They will believe it like I did. It took me a long time, and it wasn't until I became a Christian in my second year at work in the railways as a fitter turner that I realised that it was not true. And something happened. And I went from being an academic failure at school to getting top of New Zealand in my trade. In just August to November. Well, actually, it was the end of October, beginning of November. That was the kind of turnaround that happened. Because when we actually start getting a right perspective, it shifts everything. And Henry Ford was great at changing that perspective. The second one I want to touch on, and this isn't his plane. I just couldn't find his plane anywhere on any graphics. It was Howard Hughes. It should have an S on the end, shouldn't it? Dear old Howard, one of the greatest inventors in history, in recent history. Had some great ideas and had the skills and the money and the ability to pull people on board to do the things. But he built this plane called the Goose. Big plane, huge. It was the largest plane ever been built. He spent huge amounts of money on it. That plane did one flight because he was afraid that it would fail. Now that's crazy. to spend millions of dollars on a plane and to fly it on one flight and never fly it again in case it failed? That is absolute craziness. To be so successful and yet to fail at such a dramatic edge. And he failed in other ways too. He had a fear that women were contagious with disease, and so he wore white gloves and women weren't allowed in his presence near the end of his life. He had some kind of, I think, mental illness at the end, but it's just so sad that he went through the whole deal. And I just wonder what caused that whole trigger point to happen. You don't want to be like that, eh? And the last person is Edison. You can see the light bulbs in his hand because Edison was a guy who failed and 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 failed to make a light bulb. One light bulb. Now we appreciate these things right now. But because Edison, he tried horsehair, he tried rabbit hair, he tried bits of plants from all over the world, he tried making stuff, he tried metals, he tried all sorts of things. In fact, it's been said that he made thousands and thousands of light bulbs that never worked. But suddenly, one light bulb worked. Just one. And he didn't turn back to the thousands previous to that and say, they're a great set of my failure, and I only succeeded once, so therefore I am a failure. He didn't do that. He got that light bulb and he manufactured it, he developed it, and he helped others to develop them. And today we appreciate the fact that Edison was prepared to fail so that he could succeed. Are you prepared to take the risk to fail so you can succeed? Because that's what it's all about. Amen? And if you're not going to take the risk, you're never going to succeed. If you're not going to take the risks, you'll never succeed. Some of you know me well enough to know that I'm a bit of an inventor myself, and I've designed a number of different types of gadgets and machines and things. And before I came to pastoral ministry, I was successful in that field, and I was design and development officer for Lane Walker Rudkins and fitter in charge of workshop as well, and safety officer for our part of the company. And I look back on those days and I think, what a wonderful thing. But I got to tell you, some of the things we made were dumb. They failed awfully. They failed awfully, some of those things. And you need to know that sometimes when I've been preparing things, doing things, I've made a whole PowerPoint presentation for the church for a thing like this. I got near the end and I thought, pfft, and I've hit delete. Go away. Start again. That's the kind of work it takes sometimes. You don't just get up and do these things. So what I want to suggest, and this is my last slide, I want to suggest for every one of us in this room, there are points of failure that we have, undiscovered or discovered, no matter what they are. We are duty bound, I think, to spend some time thinking about who we are. And in context of that, I want to suggest that we need to think about who we are in the light of our Creator as well. Because if we don't, we can't appreciate who we might be, I believe. See, what did He design me to be? Can I get my head around that? What kinds of things could I achieve in life that I've never achieved? How could relationships be better for me? Certainly one of the things that Jesus spent some time on was helping people sort their relationships within the group of people He was working with. There were jealousy spats and things like that, where he intervened. He taught people what it was like to be successful. He lived the life, He walked the life, and He told them to go and do the same thing. And they go out, and it was such an exciting thing that we have it recorded that they came back and they said, "Hey, Jesus, guess what happened?" He said, "Don't get too excited about it, guys. The most important thing about this whole deal is that your names are written in the book of life. That's more important. You're succeeding, but the success isn't what you have done. It's who you are. It's who you are at the end of the day. And we need to be taking steps and thinking about that and reflecting on that and knowing that God wants us to understand who we are meant to be, not who we are at the moment necessarily. But you need to understand who you are now so that you can understand what you need to do to become what He might want you to be. And I want to finish with that note this morning and say that the discovery of yourself in the light of God is the best thing that you could ever have. He doesn't want bad for you. He wants the best. I'm going to talk to Him and invite you to do the same this morning. If you'd like to join us in talking with Him, feel free. You don't have to. We don't want people to feel like the hypocrites here. But at the end of it, I'm going to say, and all the people said, and if you want to respond to God right now, you can say amen when I say that, because that means I agree. So let's talk to Him. Father God, each one of us here in this room knows at what points we fail. Some of us because we don't achieve at the level we could. We're slack in things that we should be a little more focused on. Or we're giving far too much time to things we shouldn't be giving to, and we're causing our families to lack or other areas in our lives to be weakened because we're not doing what is best. God, sometimes we fail because we intentionally set out to fail, or because we're bought into stuff that we've inherited or we've started to develop in our life. And we simply want to say to you this morning that we would like you to help us and to forgive us for the times when we've failed intentionally, where we have failed you and we have failed ourselves, where we have lied and cheated and deceived, committed sin, whether it be sexual sin or just being dishonest, whether it be pretending we can do things that we can't, or whether it be the fact that we don't do what we could do. So we ask you to help us. We'd like to come in line with the best that you want us to be, because we're getting some idea of what it would be to be like that. And although we can't see it in ourselves, we can see that what happened to Peter afterwards as he became the leader of the Christian church, one of the very key leaders of the Christian church, and a guy who was resolute, who did turn around and help his brothers at the end of the day. And 12 guys took your gospel right throughout the whole world, and that's an amazing story. So help us to be just like that. In Jesus' name we pray. And all the people said, amen. Well, Lord bless you. Let's give the team here a great big appreciation for what they did here this morning. I don't know whether you've ever thought about this as you walk into a building like this and you come in here. There's a group of people that welcome us at the doors, and we don't very often show appreciation to them. They welcome us, they show us what we need to know, they answer our questions for us. Let's do a special thank you. May the Lord